On the coldest morning of the winter, Irene Wallace woke up before her alarm because her apartment felt wrong. Not cold, worse than cold. Dead. She sat up in bed and listened. The window rattled in the wind. A truck groaned somewhere on 31st Street. But from the radiator under the window, there was no soft hiss, no warm tick of metal, no heat at all. Irene swung her feet to the floor and grabbed her robe. The wood was ice under her toes. She crossed the hall, touched the radiator in the kitchen, and pulled her hand back fast. "No, no, no," she said. She had lived in the building on 31st Street in Queens for 9 years and managed it for 3. It was 6 stories of old brick, narrow halls, and tenants who knew every sound it made. Most mornings, she dealt with a leak, a stuck door, or somebody locked out. This morning was different. This morning, the heat was gone, and outside the air had a hard blue look that promised trouble. She pulled on jeans, thick socks, a sweater, and her work coat. Then she went down to the basement with a flashlight and her keys jangling at her belt. The boiler room smelled like dust, oil, and old iron. The big red boiler sat under a low ceiling, humming only in her memory. Now it was quiet. Irene checked the gauge. The pressure was too low. A small brass valve near the feed line was dripping, one slow drop at a time, into a pan that had seen better days. She crouched and touched the valve carefully. It was cold and stiff. Luis Vega, the building porter, came in behind her with a mop in one hand and his knit cap pulled low. "You feel that?" he asked. "I feel a dead boiler," Irene said. Luis leaned in, looked at the gauge, and let out a long breath. "That old valve finally gave up?" "Looks like it." He pointed at the drip. "Can you tighten it?" Irene shook her head. "If I touch it wrong, it snaps. Then we really have a problem." Her phone buzzed in her pocket before she could say more. She looked at the screen and sighed. It was Harold Levin, the landlord. She answered. "Morning, Mr. Levin. Why is Mrs. Alvarez calling me at 6:30 in the morning asking if the heat's out?" he snapped. Irene stood up straight, though he could not see her. "Because the heat is out. I'm in the boiler room now. The valve failed. I need a replacement." "Need," he barked. "The city inspector is coming by noon. Do you understand that? Noon." Irene closed her eyes for 1 second. "Yes, I understand. Then fix it. I don't want a violation on my building because you can't handle a little cold snap." Purse. "It is not a little cold snap," she said, but he had already started talking to someone else. Maybe on another line, maybe in another world. The call ended. Luis gave her a look. He always sound like that? "Only when something costs money," Irene said. She pulled the valve open, just enough to see the threads. Old brass, old size, old enough that the local supply house in Queens would probably shrug and send her away. She knew what she needed because she had fixed enough buildings in her life to know when a part was rare. The whole feed line needed one brass valve, the kind many stores did not keep anymore. But she knew one place that might. "Brooklyn," she said. Luis blinked. "You're going to Brooklyn for a valve?" "If I can't find it in Queens, yes." He gave a low whistle. "On the subway?" "That's the plan." She looked at the boiler one more time, then at the clocks hanging in the hallway upstairs through the open basement door. Tenants were already up. She could hear footsteps, a baby crying, and a door opening and closing. She needed to move. By 7 o'clock, the lobby was full of coats. Mrs. Alvarez from 4C stood near the mailboxes with her little boy wrapped in a blanket. Mr. Chen from 2 Billion wore 2 sweaters and a baseball cap pulled over his ears. Mrs. Donnelly from 5A had a scarf tied around her head like she was going out into a snowstorm, even though she stood inside. A few others hovered near the front door, rubbing their hands together. "Irene," Mrs. Alvarez said, "the baby is shivering." "I know," Irene said. "I'm going to get the part. Louis will stay with the boiler." Mr. Chen frowned at the cold air blowing in each time the front door opened. "How long?" "Not long," Irene said, though she did not know if that was true. Mrs. Donnelly pointed at the dead radiator in the lobby. "The city man is coming, right? At noon, if he stays on schedule." That made the group go quiet. Irene turned to the front desk, grabbed her notebook, the broken valve stem she had wrapped in a paper towel, and her wallet. She jammed her hat on her head and headed out. The wind hit her like a slap when she stepped onto 31st Street. Cars were already parked with a skin of frost on the windows. A delivery man in gloves was unloading boxes into a deli across the street. Somewhere, a bus hissed and pulled away. She walked fast to the subway, head down, shoulders tight. At the station, warm air came up from the stairs in a stale rush. A woman in a red puffer coat was arguing with a machine that would not take her card. 2 teenagers in hoodies stomped their feet and laughed at the cold. Irene swiped through and went down to the platform. A sign said the next train was delayed. "Of course it is," she muttered. When the train came, it was already crowded. Everyone looked tired and wrapped up in layers. Irene found a strap to hold and kept one hand on her coat pocket, where the broken stem and the cash sat together. She watched the dark tunnels flash past the windows. At Queensboro Plaza, she changed trains with the rest of the rush hour crowd. The stairway was slippery near the edges, and one man almost lost his coffee. He caught it just in time. "Morning," he said, to no one in particular. "Not for me," Irene answered, and he laughed once, then looked at her face and stopped laughing. On the Brooklyn train, she checked her phone again. One message from Mr. Levin, "Where are you?" One from Luis, still dead. One from Mrs. Alvarez, sent by text because her hands were probably full. "Please hurry." Irene put the phone away and stared at the black tunnel as the train shook and clanged forward. She had no time for the landlord's voice in her head. No time for fear about the inspector. She needed the right part, and she needed it now. The hardware store was on a side street in Sunset Park, squeezed between a bakery and a shop that sold phone cases and cheap tools. The sign above the door was old enough that the paint had gone thin. Inside, the place smelled like wood, machine oil, and hot dust from the heater near the back. A man with gray hair and wire glasses looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked. Irene held up the broken valve stem. "I need a brass valve, 1 inch, old style, threaded like this." He took the piece, turned it in his hand, and nodded at once. "Boiler feed line?" "Yes." "You're lucky, I still have one." He walked to the back without another word. Irene stood very still. Her heart, which had been pounding all morning, gave one hard jump. The man came back with a dusty box. He opened it and lifted out a brass valve that matched the shape of the broken one almost exactly. "This one?" he asked. She leaned in and looked. "That's it." He smiled a little. These old buildings in Queens and Brooklyn keep me in business. Everybody wants new stuff until the heat stops. How much? He named a price. It was not cheap, but it was less than a fine from the city, and a lot less than the frozen pipes. Irene paid with her card, then added a small packet of gasket tape and a tube of pipe sealant. The man put the valve in a paper bag. "You heading back now?" "Right now," she said. He handed it to her with both hands, like he knew what was at stake. On the train back, the bag sat on Irene's lap, like a prize she was afraid to breathe on. She kept checking the time. 9:14, 9:28, 9:41. The train stopped between stations once for almost 10 minutes, and she could feel the whole car grow tense around her. A child asked his mother if they were stuck forever. The mother said, "No, honey," in a voice that sounded like she did not believe it. Irene looked at her phone again. Another call from Mr. Levin. She let it ring. When the train finally moved again, she counted the stops under her breath. Back in Queens, she came out into air so cold it hurt her teeth. She ran the last block to the building, the bag tucked tight under her coat. Inside, the lobby looked worse than before. The windows had a white edge of frost. People sat on the front steps with scarves over their mouths. A couple of tenants were holding paper cups of coffee from the deli next door, steam rising from the tops. "You got it?" Louis called from the basement door. Irene held up the bag. He let out a cheer that made Mrs. Alvarez smile for the first time all morning. "Thank God," Mrs. Donnelly said. Irene did not stop for the relief in the lobby. She went straight down to the basement, Louise close behind with a flashlight and a wrench. The boiler room felt even colder now. She set the new valve on a clean rag, then shut the main feed and drained the line. Water gurgled into a bucket. The old valve was jammed tight with rust and age. She put the wrench on it, braced her feet, and pulled. Nothing. She pulled again, harder this time. The pipe gave a sharp metallic scream. "Easy," Louis said. "I am being easy," Irene answered through her teeth. She worked the wrench back and forth, inch by inch, until the valve finally moved with a painful jerk. A dark stain of old water ran down the pipe. She stopped to breathe, then loosened it the rest of the way and took it off. The threads were worn nearly smooth. "That thing should have failed years ago," Louise said. "Tell that to the landlord," Irene said. She cleaned the pipe, wrapped the new threads with tape, brushed on the sealant, and set the brass valve in place. Her hands were cold, but she moved with care. 1 turn. 2 turns. The metal caught. She tightened it until it sat firm and straight. Then she opened the feed slowly. For 1 long second, nothing happened. Irene looked at the gauge. The needle climbed. "Come on," she whispered. A low sound rolled through the boiler, deep and heavy, like a giant waking up. Then the burner caught with a soft whoosh. Heat began to move through the pipes. It started as a faint tick. Then came the pop of metal warming. Then another. A little steam lifted from the line above the boiler and curled into the air. Louise grinned. "There she goes." Irene reached up and turned the thermostat. The boiler answered with a stronger hum, steady and alive. At the same moment, the basement door flew open above them, and a rush of voices poured down the stairs. "I smell heat," someone shouted. Irene wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and climbed the basement steps. The lobby had changed in the last few minutes. It was still crowded, but now it was full of motion instead of worry. Mrs. Alvarez had a mug in one hand and a blanket in the other. Mr. Chen carried 2 plastic hand warmers from the deli. Mrs. Donnelly held a tray of coffee cups from the corner shop. The baby in Mrs. Alvarez's arms had stopped crying and was looking around with sleepy eyes. Warm air was spilling from the lobby radiator at last. Then the front door opened, and Harold Levin came in fast, his face red from the cold. Behind him stood the city inspector, a man in a black coat with a clipboard and stiff gloves. Levin looked at Irene, then at the steam rising from the radiator, then at the people in the lobby with their coffee and blankets. "Well," he said, trying to sound calm and failing, "about time." The inspector did not even look at him first. He held out a hand over the radiator, felt the heat, and nodded. "The building's warm," he said. "That's what matters." Levin stared at Irene, as if he wanted to blame her anyway, but there was nowhere to put it now. Irene stood by the basement door, the old wrench still in her hand, her work coat dusted with boiler grime, her hair escaping from under her hat. Her boots left wet marks on the tile. She was tired down to her bones, but the warm air touched her face, and the whole lobby seemed to breathe again. Mrs. Alvarez lifted her coffee cup toward Irene. "You did it," she said. Mr. Chen nodded. "Good work." Louis came up behind Irene and held up the empty paper bag like a flag. From the basement, the boiler gave one more deep, steady hum. Then the pipes carried heat up into the building, floor by floor, apartment by apartment, like a promise finally kept. Irene looked at the inspector, then at the landlord, then at her neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder in coats and scarves and tired boots. "Heat's back," she said. And this time the whole building believed her.